Hi, well, this is part two of a short screencast for Independent College Dublin for Cima E2 for November 2014. So we're looking at the next set of five possible themes for the November exam. Not so much in terms of predictions, but certainly things I wouldn't walk into the exam not knowing. So three parts in all. This is the second part. So number 6 for us here is just this idea again of strategy formulation. And really what we're looking at there is the resource-based view, possibly on a standalone basis, but often compared by your examiner to the positioning view. So this resource-based view, really, it is the inside-out view as opposed to the outside-in view. And that's a point that you've got to make in your answer. And what does it involve? Well, as it says on the tin, it's very much looking at the company or the organization's resources and competences. So what do they have? What are they good at? Obviously, resources can be split into tangible and intangible. We're familiar with that. And we'll know that competences are really very much what we are good at. And the whole resource-based view really centers around this idea of stretching everything that we have. So stretching the resources, stretching our competences, and really wringing out as much as we can out of them. If this does come up, several theorists that I think that we need to remember, you'll have read about them in your text, Pralahad and Hamel and indeed Barney, and they talk about really very much the same thing, the fact that resources have to be unique, rare, add value, etc., etc. So be familiar with these, what Pralahad and Hamel and indeed Barney say about the resources and competences, and it's very, very similar between the three of them. And also in terms of the positioning view, obviously we've said that that's outside in, and I guess that the rational approach would fall under the positioning view in the sense that we're looking at the external environment and really trying to gauge or set our strategy based on what's happening outside. And as you'd appreciate, that's pretty difficult to do. Indeed, there are a lot of issues concerned with doing that, and it may well be that we could provide an example of companies that don't do that. A good one under the resource-based view would probably be Apple in terms of the various devices that they developed, their products that they've developed over the last sort of 5 to 10 years or so. So key points then, I think in terms of the resource-based view are key buzzwords as to what it is, inside out as opposed to outside in. The key theorists are important. And, perhaps helpful maybe a criticism or criticisms of the resource-based view in the sense that it may be difficult for people to understand. It may be difficult to perhaps for a business to understand exactly what its core competences are or what its resources are. So there are some downsides which you'll see listed within your text. So have a look at those also, and also any questions that you can see that involve both of these. Okay. Next area here is a model. I referred to that in part one in terms of the diamond. Obviously, Porter's a key theorist. The five forces model, fairly easy to deal with. Our first port of call there is really learning or rote learning the elements, including power of buyers, suppliers, etc., and substitutes and barriers to entry. So, those are a gimme. I think the key point in terms of earning good marks in a question like this, as I've said before in relation to models, is being able to apply the model to the scenario. And as I've said with the diamond, because we have those five elements, we have a structure to work with. I guess in the first instance, though, what you'd be looking to do is maybe define what Porter's five forces does, or what it helps us to do, in the sense is that really it allows us to establish the attractiveness of a given market or a given industry, or indeed the profitability. So make sure you define first. I often see with these five forces questions, what the examiner tends to do is, outside of the first paragraph, list the forces first in a short list, and then list them again and obviously go into detail. No harm in doing that. It certainly gives you a marker, a good fix on the fact that you know those elements. Now, one or two other points in the five forces. I think that one of the things that I've noticed that students miss out on there, as I've mentioned within my classes, is they may well learn the forces, and hopefully they do, but it's just that application area that's important. And really the essence of a five forces question is really to firstly to give examples perhaps of under each of the headings. So, for example, in relation to threat of substitutes, a substitute, let's be clear, is something that fulfills a product or a service that fulfills the same need. It's not necessarily exactly the same type of product. So, perhaps give an example of that, given the scenario or the industry that you're given. But over and above that, in each of the forces is really to identify the strength of the forces. In other words, is this force strong or is it weak? So as a simple example, perhaps under the power of buyers, generally speaking, if there are fewer buyers, their strength will be higher. So they will have a high strength, and therefore that perhaps makes the industry less attractive. Similar really for suppliers. With fewer suppliers, again, their strength will be higher, and again, that makes the industry perhaps less attractive. Bear in mind that the way that the examiner could come up or could come at this particular area is either that the company is in the industry already and assessing its position, or perhaps a company that's outside the industry or market and looking to go in. But at the end of the day, what they're looking for you to do is most likely to make a decision based on your analysis using the five forces as to whether or not it's a good idea to go in or indeed to stay in. So giving a view in each of your paragraphs on strength of the forces is important. Okay. Next one here, not commonly examined, but a fairly easy question if you know the basics: corporate governance. And we know that corporate governance is about the way in which companies are managed and controlled, or indeed directed and controlled. So first paragraph, I'd expect that definition to come in. And what's the purpose of corporate governance? Well, essentially, it's going to assist or aid companies to operate more efficiently and indeed effectively. And it really stems obviously from a series of corporate scandals. No harm in mentioning one or two, perhaps Mirror Group and Robert Maxwell, or indeed Enron, or our favorite phrase, Enronitis. So really what we're concerned with is that there are a set of principles, and under the UK code it's certainly principles based, not rules based, as per SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley in the US. So that's regulation. And really what companies are required to do is to adhere to the guidelines under the UK combined code. So the latest code would be 2010, and we'll see that over the last sort of 20 years or prior to 2010, there are a multitude of reports really stemming from the Cadbury report in 1992 through up to 2010, and the latest version of the UK combined code. And within that code, obviously, a variety of things, including elements relating to the effectiveness of the board and leadership, really through to sort of the audit committee, remuneration committee, and the nominations committee. So in terms of the key theme even, I'd expect the examiner to simply give you a scenario that says, this is what's happening in this company. Identify or list each of the problems and really say what the code would provide for in these instances. Okay, so a pretty straightforward structure: definition, a little bit of background, talk of corporate scandals, then really a list style approach would work. These are the problems that I've identified within this particular company, and this is what the code says. Remember that little phrase, comply or explain. Companies and indeed all listed companies are expected to comply with principles-based codes, and if they don't, that they should disclose or explain why and indeed how they're not complying within their annual documentation or annual reports, etc. Okay. Next one, number 9, ethics. Bit of a soft topic there. What are ethics, and how would he come at this? I think the first instance is obviously ethics is just simply morals, or the difference between right and wrong. And you will be familiar with the fact that obviously Cima has a published code. our mnemonic on that is copy. Make sure that you have a fix on the elements of copy, confidentiality, objectivity, etc. Typical way to come at this, I would suggest, is obviously not dissimilar to the corporate governance number 8 above, just in terms of a scenario perhaps that has a series of problems, and what the examiner is looking for you to do is really to apply the code, apply copy to the scenario that you're given. You'll see a screencast on Moodle to that effect. So a pretty straightforward area. You often find within the ethics questions, if it is a copy style one, that quite a few of the elements of the code will be relevant. So if in doubt, I'd err on the side of caution and certainly mention as many of the elements as you can rather than just one or two. Okay. Next and final one in this part 2 is just really the issue of stakeholders, or indeed Mendeley. Now, there's a lot of mileage here for the examiner in this area, as you'd expect. Every business has a multitude of stakeholders. And in terms of the definition, we know that stakeholders are really anyone who can affect or is affected or can be affected by the business. The big chap in this area is obviously Mendeley and his grid. And I wouldn't rule out necessarily a question that asks you to detail the elements of the grid and really to map or plot a series of stakeholders from a scenario in terms of their power and interest. Okay, so be familiar with the elements of stakeholders grid and his mapping technique. Certainly be familiar with the fact that there are two axes there, power and interest, and not influence, as some students tend to use. It's interest, and also perhaps as an aside, we know that within this area of stakeholders, there are one or two other theorists, including Sayert and March. So look up Sayert and March. They come up with one or two, in fact 3 or 4 different possible strategies to deal with stakeholders, more particularly where there's conflict, where there are problems. So things like side payments and use of power, etc., etc. So no harm in sticking that in a stakeholders or Mendeley's question if it can be done quickly. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. That's part 2. Part 3 to come now. Cheers.